Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to start out by talking about naming conventions. For military aircraft and military equipment in general, across nations, across wars, and across decades, there's some kind of system, code, or guidelines when it comes to naming. In America, let's take a look at something like the FA-18C Hornet, an admittedly rule-breaking designation, but I like the name and the plane, so we're going to use it anyway. Break it down into 4 parts: the first letter or letters, the number, any letters after the number, and the given name. The first letter or letters correspond to the role and production state. F stands for fighter, and A stands for attack, thus F/A. Now, the FA-18 is unique in that slashes typically aren't allowed, but regardless. Then the 18 marks it as the 18th design in the fighter or attack category. If there's a letter after that, it denotes which series or variant they're on. So FA-18C would be the 3rd in the series. Then for the name, there aren't necessarily any specific guidelines, and each company typically employs their own naming convention. Presumably, unless the given name was something embarrassing or degrading or, I don't know, was a slur of some kind, the name was largely up to the discretion of the company. Over in Britain, their naming conventions were and are a little bit more lax and, in my opinion, a bit more fun. Typically, we refer to British aircraft by manufacturer and name, so like Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane. Now, it isn't as simple as that, and there are often mark numbers denoting variants and the series, so like Spitfire Mark II, along with role prefixes like Spitfire LF2, LF meaning low altitude fighter. The part that I want to focus on, though, are the given names. Very often, for British aircraft, their role influenced their name. Heavy bombers and transports, for example, were named after British towns and cities. Planes that were purchased from America were often given more American-sounding names. Trainers were named after schools, and other words that meant teacher. And for naval aircraft, their names were part of a fun nautical theme, and more specifically, torpedo bombers were named after fish. It's one of these fish-named torpedo bombers that I want to talk about today, a mid-war plane with a rather difficult development cycle and also a rather bizarre problem that led to several pilot deaths. This is the Fairey Barracuda, or if you prefer, the Ooh Barracuda. You know, like the song by Heart, Barracuda. Alright, anyway, in 1937, the British Air Ministry would issue Specification S-2437, a call for a new monoplane torpedo bomber / dive bomber / reconnaissance aircraft. Several sources list 2 different planes that this specification was to replace, either the Fairey Swordfish or the Fairey Albacore. I think it's more likely that the specification was to replace the Albacore, even though in late 1937, early 1938, when the specification was issued, the Albacore hadn't actually even flown yet. But the whole process for specification S-2437 would take years, from submission to prototype to full production. In this time, the Albacore should reach production, replace the Swordfish, and then be replaced by the winner of 2437. I think they issued this specification before the Albacore even flew, because the Albacore was a biplane, and biplanes were becoming less and less prominent by the year, in favor of the better performance that was offered by monoplanes. Now, this wasn't actually how things ended up playing out, and while the Albacore would come into service in March 1940, it never really replaced the Swordfish. In fact, the Swordfish outlived the Albacore despite being introduced in 1936. But that's a different story for a different day. For specification 2437, The Air Ministry requested a plane with a max weight of 10,500 pounds, and that carried one 1,500-pound torpedo or 1,500 pounds of explosives in various configurations. It was also, of course, to be a monoplane and was to have high speed. How high that speed, I'm not sure, they just said high speed. The Air Ministry sent these specifications to 6 companies and received 6 designs in return. The company Blackburn would return their B-29 design. From Bristol would come an unnamed design. From Fairey, the Type 100 design. From Hawker, another unnamed design. From Supermarine, the 322. And from Westland, the P-10. Of these 6 designs, just 2 of them were accepted to advance to the prototype phase, the Fairey Type 100 later renamed to the Barracuda, and the Supermarine 322. Now we will return to the 322 later, as it was the Barracuda's competition here, but for the Barracuda, Fairey would receive a contract for prototype production sometime between July 1938 and January 1939, for 2 prototypes to be made. This initial design would measure in at 12.12 meters long, 14.99 meters wide, and 4.62 meters tall, to be outfitted with a Rolls-Royce X with around 1,200 horsepower. This engine was a 24-cylinder X-block engine still in development at the time of the Barracuda prototypes being built. The Barracuda's wings would be rather high set, just under the cockpit canopy, and attached to the wings would be a pair of Fairey Youngman flaps. These flaps were a bit more versatile than your standard flaps that would pivot around a single point, in that they could move on a second pivot that could raise them, lower them, or push them to the rear. They could also be angled upwards to act as dive brakes. So basically, they were flaps and dive brakes in the same unit. They were also rather large, giving the appearance of almost a quasi-biplane when they were lowered. As the Barracuda was to serve on aircraft carriers as well, the wings could fold, but unlike a lot of other planes that folded upwards mid-wing, at the wing root of the Barracuda towards the tail, the Barracuda's wings would hinge backwards. They would hook onto the tail to prevent them from accidentally swinging free as well. The flaps would hinge above the wings in this storage mode. Moving back to the tail, the initial design would be pretty standard. In the cockpit, there would be a crew of 3, the pilot in the front, and the navigator and gunner in the rear. The gunner in the back would man 2 .303 caliber Vickers machine guns facing to the rear. This was the only gun armament on the plane. Almost immediately with this initial design, there was a problem. The Rolls-Royce X engine was going through some trouble in its development. Although it actually performed reliably enough and certainly wasn't a bad engine, for a country at war, it just didn't make the most sense to actually produce it. When compared to more simplistic engines like the Rolls-Royce Merlin, with its V shape and not an X shape, the X took either more time or resources to produce. While the X was more powerful overall than the early Merlin engines, it was estimated that about 6 times as many Merlins could be produced as X's. That meant 6 times as many planes in the air, potentially. Because of this, the X was eventually cancelled, and the Merlin in its many variants was given priority. Even still, when they decided that the Barracuda should not be using the X engine, it still took several months before they decided to use the Merlin. And when they did, they would actually have to start altering the design schematics to fit the larger Merlin engine. They also would try to move the wings from high set just below the cockpit to a more low set position. But they found that doing this would lead to a cascading series of design alterations that simply wasn't worth it. So the wings were then moved back up to just under the cockpit as original. With all of this engine jumbling and design jumbling, the first flight of the Barracuda, a strange sentence out of context, was delayed through 1939 and through most of 1940 as well, only taking to the air for the first time on December 7th, 1940. At this time, it was outfitted with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 30, with around 1,250 horsepower, more horsepower than the X was projected to have, but far lower RPM. The performance overall was okay-ish, maybe mediocre. While it would have a relatively solid top speed for a torpedo/dive bomber at 269 miles an hour without a torpedo, and around 249 with a torpedo, considering its role, this wasn't all that important. And overall, the lower power Merlin 30, in conjunction with more and more equipment being added and minor design changes adding weight along the way, the plane overall was underpowered, which resulted in very long takeoff times, which is not good for a carrier-based plane. In addition to this issue, while the more versatile flaps worked properly and were useful as dive brakes when they were angled up to act as dive brakes, this airflow disruption led to significant problems with the tail and tail control surfaces. What I assume happened is when the flaps were angled up, it caused a lot of airflow to be diverted over the tail and its horizontal fins and surfaces. This led to significant vibrational issues and an overall loss of effectiveness of the tail control surfaces. While the whole underpowered issue could be mitigated, or I guess just dealt with or ignored, the tail issues simply could not, and this necessitated a new design change, which came with the second prototype on June 29, 1941. This new design had a relatively simple fix in that the horizontal tail surfaces were moved towards the top of the vertical tail surface, giving an almost T-tail style design. This change seems to have fixed the tail vibration issues, and from then on, the T-tail would become standard on the Barracuda. Shortly after, the first official production run of the Barracuda would begin in the Mark I, still with the Merlin 30 engine and the new T-tail. But because of the insufficient power of the Merlin 30 and the still increasing weight that had ballooned up to 13,500 pounds max, the production of the Mark I would be a rather short one, with just 28 to 30 models produced in total, at least 23 of them by Fairey and 5 contracted out to Westland. To increase the power, the Merlin 30 was swapped out with an improved version called the Merlin 32, which came with a significant boost in horsepower and performance at lower altitudes, rising up to 1,620 horsepower. However, this didn't actually seem to lead to a boost in top speed at all, really, as the top speed without the torpedo now sat at 240 miles an hour, and with torpedo it was down to 228 at 1,700 feet or so. Now, the past top speeds that were upwards of 270 miles an hour were actually achieved at around 10,000 feet, so those top speeds would have been lower at 1,700 feet, and probably would have been lower than the new engine variant, but not by all that much. However, with this new engine and its increased power, and the plane's now slightly increased weight again, up to 14,250 pounds max, this brought about better overall performance and much better taking off performance, and this new design would be dubbed the Mark II. Orders would be placed for them by late 1941, and Fairey, Blackburn, Bhutan Paul, and Westland, in small numbers, began producing the Mark II, from hundreds to over 1,000 of them. These Mark IIs would begin reaching units in early 1943, and around this time, the Barracuda's competition, the Supermarine 322, would fly for the first time. If the Barracuda was delayed, then what does that make the 322? Really delayed is the answer there. Initially, back in the original design competition, the 322 was actually rejected for being too experimental, in that it had variable incidence wings that could be angled anywhere from 2 degrees up to 16 degrees. Combine this with flaps, the 322 wings could generate a lot of lift if needed, far more than most other planes. But because such a design concept was only really used in experimental designs, it was initially rejected. However, in 1939, the project was revived, and an order for 2 prototypes was placed. Production was very slow, as Supermarine was largely occupied with the production of the Spitfire, so it would be about 4 years until the 322 flew for the first time on February 6, 1943. Shortly thereafter, the second prototype would fly with a Merlin 32 installed, and the 322 actually performed a bit better than the Barracuda, with a top speed of 279 miles an hour. Its performance was solid enough, and it also had a great nickname of Dumbo as well, but because the Barracuda had such a head start, and Supermarine was still largely occupied with the Spitfire, the 322 and its 2 prototypes was destined to live as a proof of concept or technology demonstrator, something that probably would have worked in the field and probably would have served well, but at this point was just not necessary. Making the 322 even more unnecessary now was the fact that by the time that the Barracuda began serving with combat units in 1943, not in combat but being incorporated into combat units, the role that it was designed to fill was less necessary. As a torpedo bomber, one of its primary missions early on was to be attacking and destroying Axis shipping vessels in the Atlantic, crippling the flow of resources into Germany. But as German shipping had been worn down considerably through the first few years of the war, and as Germany lacked any significant surface vessel fleet, and largely focused on U-boats that were underwater, there wasn't really a need for a new torpedo bomber to patrol the Atlantic. For that, larger twin-engine planes were often used, fitted with new radar technology that could track German submarines and drop depth charges on them. The Barracuda simply wasn't that kind of plane at the moment. It carried some radar technology, but only radar that detected surface ships, not underwater ships. Luckily for the Barracuda, though, its more variable flap system let it have a role regardless as a dive bomber, and for most of the war the Barracuda would largely serve as a dive bomber, which I do find a bit odd, as Britain notably wasn't too keen on using dive bombers, partly because they were highly susceptible to anti-aircraft fire. Despite this, the Barracuda would have a solid, if unspectacular, career as a dive bomber, often being used in support of greater Allied offensives. In such a role, planes like the Barracuda could be useful in taking out key enemy positions, thus allowing ground troops to proceed forward. Most of the Barracuda's dive bombing career would be sufficient, but with no major wow moments, apart from one specific moment. On April 3, 1944, 42 Barracudas would participate in Operation Tungsten, an attack on the German battleship Tirpitz. The ship, based out of Norway, was a major impediment to Allied shipping and missions in the Arctic Sea. The Tirpitz was an absolutely massive ship with a great deal of power behind it. In 2 attack waves, Barracudas, armed with either one 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb or 3 500-pound armor-piercing bombs, would attack with the main intent of at least crippling this massive ship, maybe destroying it if they got lucky. While they wouldn't get lucky and destroy it, they did in fact succeed in crippling it, causing over 400 German casualties and knocking it out of combat for 2 to 3 months. This was the effective peak of the Barracuda, the event that put it on the map, its shining moment. Past this, the Barracuda would play a solid, if otherwise unremarkable, role in the Allied landings on D-Day. In Europe overall, the Barracuda was decent. Over in the Pacific, the Barracuda played a lesser role, with some issues that reduced its overall effectiveness. Operating around Indonesia, and specifically the island of Java, the Barracuda's engine trade-off that it made a few years ago came back to bite it. The Merlin 32 engine had higher horsepower, but suffered in high-altitude performance. As the Barracudas would have to fly over Java to reach their targets, which were Japanese ships and subs in dock, they often had to fly over the more mountainous regions of Java. As the Merlin 32 lost a lot of power at altitude, it was a severe struggle for the Barracuda. Combine this with general higher temperatures in the region that also hurt the engines, the Barracuda's effective range dropped by as much as 30%. In the Pacific, the Barracuda would eventually be replaced by American Grumman Avengers, planes with much better performance. According to Eric Brown, the difference between the Avenger and the Barracuda was staggering, and he viewed the Avenger as being far and away better than the Barracuda Mark II. Past the Mark II, though, and its 1,688 unit production run, an alternate Mark III would begin production in early 1944, this one altered with a more powerful radar system to serve as an anti-submarine aircraft. While over 800 of these would be made, the career of the Mark III was comparatively quiet, serving in anti-submarine patrols, but I also don't know how often they actually saw combat or really did anything. Fairey would also propose a Mark IV version with an even stronger engine, but this was denied in favor of a new torpedo bomber design in the Fairey Spearfish. And they also had a Mark V design with an even more powerful engine. A few dozen or so of these were made, but then the war ended and eliminated their purpose for existing. For roughly the next decade or so after the war ended, the Barracuda served most often in reserve roles or as trainers. And despite a grand total of 2,602 planes being made, none of them exist today, but there is an effort to rebuild one. Now, before we end, we do need to talk about probably the most interesting aspect of the Barracuda, and that was the mystery of a high number of unexplained crashes that led to the deaths of several pilots. It seemed as though pilot experience didn't matter all that much, and pilots of all stripes seemed to be falling victim to some kind of issue the Barracuda had. It didn't seem to be a major mechanical problem. Something like that would probably be found in the wreckage, and for most of the war, the British military and pilots just kinda had to deal with the fact that it seemed like some Barracudas just crash sometimes. Then, in 1945, about 2 years after the plane began seeing service, they finally found the problem. The cause of the crashes was indeed not a major mechanical issue, nor was it ever the fault of the pilot. The Barracuda was accidentally knocking its pilots unconscious in normal flight and maneuvers, which of course then led to them losing control and crashing. But how was this happening? Were there excessive G-forces or something somehow? Were they maybe flying too high in thinner air? Nope, none of the above. The cause was the pressure gauge in the cockpit. Not the reading on the pressure gauge, but the gauge itself. They found that leaks tended to develop in the hydraulic system, most often in and around that pressure gauge, and they would develop in such a way that sprayed hydraulic fluid onto the pilot and into the cockpit. Their chosen hydraulic fluid contained ether, a chemical well known for its past medical use as anesthesia. So I guess in some sense, at least the Barracuda was kind enough to put its pilots to sleep before it went about murdering them. It's something, I guess. But as a whole, though, I'd say that the Fairey Barracuda story was a bit odd, from being delayed about 3 years, to not really serving in the role it was built for, to serving in a role that Britain wasn't terribly fond of. It's as if the whole project was just a bit weird. It always seemed to be just off of its intended goal, the intended purpose, and despite that, it was actually a pretty prominent and solid enough workhorse. Now, it was a workhorse that occasionally kicked its pilots in the head from time to time, but I guess a workhorse nonetheless. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, before I started writing this video, I was thinking about what my next video would be on. I was thinking the Barracuda, but I wasn't entirely sure. I was still bouncing around a couple ideas. Then I got in my car, I started cycling through my saved radio stations, and what was playing? Barracuda by heart. I kind of felt like I had to make this video at that point. The universe commanded it through music. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.